The sun beat down on the border market until the dirt itself felt like fire, the dust rising in fine sheets that clung to every throat and stung every eye. The air reeked of sweat and livestock, of hog pens and horse droppings, of desperation left too long in the open. Traders shouted prices over the noise of cattle. Coins clinked into palms, and somewhere on the edges of the market, where the crowd thinned and the shadows grew long, human voices quieted into nothing. That was where the cages stood, rough wood and rusted iron, holding those no one had bid on in too long. They sat with wrists bound, ankles swollen, faces hollowed by heat and hunger. Some leaned against each other, too weak to hold themselves upright. No one looked at them except to spit. Bo Ryland kept his gaze away as he walked past, his hat brim low, the limp in his step noticeable in the press of dust and noise. He had not come for this. He wanted horse medicine, nothing more. At 37, with broad shoulders, scarred hands, and eyes that had stopped searching for kindness years ago, he had no use for what was being sold in cages. His wife had died 5 winters back, his little girl 2 months after. Since then, he had lived alone, working cattle, mending fences, and outriding his memories. Solitude suited him. He thought it always would, until something small tugged at his coat. He looked down. A little girl stood barefoot in the dust, her hair tangled, her dress torn, her dark eyes too wide for a face so small. She could not have been more than 4. Her voice trembled in broken English as she whispered, "You do not have to take me, just take my mama." Bo froze. The girl's hand clutched his coat with a grip that trembled but did not let go. She raised her chin, pointing with one thin finger toward the shade of the corral. Bo followed her gaze. A woman slumped against the post, wrists tied above her head with rope rubbed raw into her skin. Her lip was split, one eye bruised shut, her breath shallow. She looked young still, perhaps no more than late 20s, but her body sagged with fever and neglect. The girl whispered again, her voice breaking, "She has not eaten. I gave her my bread, all of it, 2 days now." Bo crouched down, his knees aching, his eyes level with the child's. "What is her name?" he asked. The girl swallowed hard, her hands twisting in the fabric of his coat. "Lena," she said. "She is my mama. They said, if no one buys her today, they will take her away, somewhere bad." Bo stood slowly, his eyes on the woman, her head drooping against her shoulder, her chest rising faintly. He looked back at the girl, and for a moment, something old and painful stirred, a memory of his own daughter's eyes when she had cried for comfort he could not give. Without another word, he walked to the slaver, sitting by the pen. The man raised a brow when Bo dropped a leather pouch, heavy with gold, onto the table. Coins spilled out, flashing in the sun. "I will take both," Bo said. The slaver's smirk faded into surprise, then suspicion. "Both?" he asked. Bo nodded toward the child still clutching his coat. "Girl comes too." The slaver tapped his fly swatter against his knee and said, "You just bought yourself a whole mess of trouble, cowboy." Bo's voice was even, "I have had worse." He lifted the girl gently into his arms, her small body pressing against his chest without hesitation. And then he cut the ropes that bound Lena. She fell against him, light as a sack of grain, her breath hot with fever. He carried them both across the dust, while the market fell silent around him. Not one man spoke. Not one dared. Somewhere against his collar the girl's whisper carried, "Thank you for taking both." Bo did not answer, but he held them tighter. The ride back from the market was long and heavy with silence. The mare carried more than she should have, Bo steady in the saddle with the girl pressed against his side and the woman slumped across the blanket behind him. The child clung to his shirt, her little hands knotted tight, as though letting go might mean losing everything. He kept his arm firm around her, while the other steadied the reins, the limp in his leg aching with every jolt. The sun dipped lower, bleeding orange across the Texas sky, and when at last his land rose before them, the old cottonwoods swaying gentle in the wind, he felt something tighten in his chest. He had thought it would always be a place only for him, a quiet graveyard of memories. Tonight it would hold more. The cabin stood worn but sturdy, its roof patched with tin, its windows clouded with dust. Bo swung down stiffly, lifting the girl first, then the woman. Lena was light as driftwood in his arms, her skin hot with fever, her breath shallow against his shoulder. He carried her through the door, the hinges groaning as if surprised to be opened. Inside, the house smelled of smoke and leather, of meals long gone cold. He did not hesitate where to take her. The small bedroom at the back of the house waited, painted once in pale blue that had faded with time. He had not opened that door in years. The toys still sat on the windowsill. A wooden lamb, a doll with a cracked face, a pair of scuffed shoes rested under the bed. The quilt was folded neat, the same way his wife had left it before the fever took them both. A photo in an oak frame stood on the nightstand, showing a little girl, grinning wide with a lamb in her arms, her teeth crooked, her eyes bright. For a moment Bo froze in the doorway, the weight of memory pressing hard. But then he stepped forward. He laid Lena gently on the bed, pulling the quilt over her frail frame as if afraid the room itself might break at the intrusion. The girl, Rosita, stood close to the doorway, her eyes wide as she watched him. She did not move until he stepped back. Then she hurried to her mother's side, climbing onto the mattress and pressing her small hand against Lena's cheek. "She's burning," she whispered. Bo nodded, his voice low. "We'll get that down." He moved to the stove, lighting a fire, filling the kettle, pulling out the tin of willow bark he kept for his own aches. His hands, used to rope and branding iron, worked clumsy over small tasks, but he did not stop. He showed Rosita how to soak the cloth, how to press it against her mother's temple. The child obeyed, her face solemn, her small fingers careful. Bo leaned against the doorframe then, watching the two of them. Candlelight flickered across the walls, catching on the toys, on the photo, on the quilt. For years, the room had been a shrine to silence, a place he could not enter without breaking apart. Now it glowed again, filled with effort and breath, and the soft hum of a little girl who would not stop fighting for her mother. Bo folded his arms across his chest, eyes lowered, the ache in him deep but stirring. For the first time in years, the house did not feel empty. It felt alive. The cabin fell into a rhythm of quiet work and waiting. Lena lay still in the blue room, her face pale against the pillow, her breath shallow, but steady enough to give hope. Bo rose before dawn each morning, his boots scuffing the floor as he stirred the fire and set water to boil. Rosita followed close behind, her small feet pattering across the boards, her eyes fixed on her mother, as though she feared she might vanish if left unwatched. Together they tended to her, awkward partners in a task neither had expected. Bo crushed willow bark with the butt of his knife, mixed it into molasses, and coaxed Rosita to touch the spoon to her mother's lips. Sometimes Lena swallowed, sometimes she did not. When sweat dampened her hairline, he wrung out cloths and set them on her brow, teaching Rosita to do the same with her smaller hands. He cleaned her wrists where the rope had cut deep, wrapping them in strips of linen until they looked less raw. His fingers, rough and scarred from years of ranch work, moved slow and careful, as though he feared breaking her. Rosita watched and copied, her little tongue poking between her teeth with concentration as she dabbed water against cracked lips. At night, the girl curled at the foot of the bed, clutching her mother's hand in her sleep. Bo stayed in a chair by the doorway, his rifle resting across his lap, his blanket folded beneath him. He did not cross the threshold once the chores were done, not wanting to disturb the fragile peace in the room. Instead, he listened in the dark, to the creak of the house settling, to Rosita's soft breaths, to the faint rasp of Lena's lungs. The sounds filled a silence that once had only been his own, and though it hurt, it also steadied him. By the second evening, Bo noticed changes. Lena's fever eased slightly, her face less flushed, her hands less limp, when he adjusted the quilt. Rosita's hope grew louder, her voice humming broken songs in Spanish as she brushed hair back from her mother's forehead. The child's small laughter, rare but bright, carried into the kitchen, where Bo sat with his coffee, and it cut through the years of hollow quiet like a knife through rope. He had forgotten how much sound a house could hold. On the third morning, as the sun sent pale light across the window, Bo bent to change the cloth on Lena's wrist. Her fingers twitched. He stilled, watching as her eyelids fluttered open, dark eyes snapping sharp and wild as a cornered animal. She groaned and tried to sit up, gasping as pain flared through her side. Bo stepped forward, hands raised to steady her, but she recoiled with a sudden strength, voice raw and hoarse. "Stay away!" Her chest heaved, her gaze darting from him to the door, her hand clutching the quilt like a shield. Before Bo could answer, Rosita stirred and scrambled up, her arms wrapping tight around her mother's neck. "Mama!" she cried. "I'm here! You're safe!" Lena's arms shook as they closed around the child, holding her so fiercely she trembled. Bo stood frozen in the doorway, his hands still raised, watching the reunion he had once thought he would never see again in his own life. Lena's eyes flicked toward him over her daughter's shoulder, sharp with mistrust. He lowered his hands slowly, stepping back into the shadows, his voice low and steady. "You're safe now." But her eyes stayed wary, her body taut, ready to fight. For her, safety was not yet something she believed. The morning light crept across the blue room, catching on the faded paint and the toys left untouched for years. Lena sat propped against the headboard, her wrists still bandaged, her body sore but her eyes sharp and restless. Rosita had gone outside to feed the hens with a tin pail, her small figure skipping through the yard, leaving mother and rancher alone in a silence that pressed too close. Bo stood near the hearth, with a basin of water, wringing out a clean cloth. His movements were steady, practiced after days of tending her. But Lena's gaze followed him with suspicion. Every motion weighed and judged. When he stepped toward her with the cloth, she flinched, her breath quickening. He paused, holding it out for her to take, but she did not reach for it. Instead, her eyes darted around the room, landing on the wooden brush resting on the nightstand. She snatched it up, the handle clutched tight in her hand, her knuckles white. "Stay away," she snapped, her voice hoarse but fierce. "I swear I will fight you." Bo froze, his broad frame still as stone, his hand lowering slowly. Lena's chest rose and fell in fast bursts, her dark eyes flashing with fear and fury. "You bought me," she spat, her voice trembling. "You think that means I belong to you like land or cattle?" Her arm shook as she raised the brush higher, the bristles trembling in her grip. Her words came faster, ragged and splintered. "That gold you paid, that was for me, wasn't it? To own me, to use me." Bo's jaw tightened, but his eyes did not harden. He stood steady, his voice quiet when he answered, "No." Lena stepped forward with sudden strength, swinging the brush against his shoulder. The wood cracked against him, once, twice, her breath breaking into sobs with each strike. He did not move to stop her. He did not raise a hand. He only stood there and took it, his silence heavier than her fury. Her blows slowed, her arm weakening, until the brush slipped from her grasp and clattered to the floor. She stood shaking, tears streaking her dirt-stained cheeks, her voice raw. "Then why?" she whispered. "Why take me at all?" Bo's eyes met hers, steady and unflinching. "For her," he said simply, nodding toward the doorway, where the sound of Rosita's laughter carried faint through the walls. Lena's lips parted, her face twisting as if she wanted to argue, but no words came. She sank back onto the bed, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders trembling with a mixture of rage and grief. Bo bent down, picked up the brush, and set it gently back on the nightstand. He did not reach for her again. Instead, he stepped back to the doorway, his voice low but clear. "No one owns you. Not me, not anyone." Then he turned and left her in the room, the echo of his words lingering heavier than any blow she had struck. Lena sat in the quiet that followed, her chest aching, her hands still trembling. She had been ready for chains, for cruelty, for the weight of another man's claim, but not for this. His refusal unsettled her more than any violence could have, and though her heart still pounded with fear, a sliver of doubt slid through the walls she had built, leaving her with questions she had no answers for. Night settled heavy over the cabin, the kind of dark that swallowed sound and left only the crackle of the fire in the hearth. Lena lay awake in the blue room, her body aching, her wrists throbbing beneath the bandages Bo had wrapped with surprising gentleness. She stared at the ceiling, her mind a restless storm. Every part of her wanted to believe she had traded one chain for another, that men were all cut from the same cloth, that the rancher outside her door was only biding his time before he claimed what he thought he had bought. The thought kept her muscles tense and her breath shallow, even when exhaustion pressed her down. Beside her, Rosita stirred, rolling over and curling closer. The child had been whispering to her all day, chattering about the hens, about the smell of stew, about how Bo had shown her the proper way to carry a pail so it didn't spill. Lena listened, but said little. Her voice still edged with suspicion even as her daughter's excitement bubbled. Now, in the hush of night, Rosita whispered again, her voice low but clear enough to cut through Lena's thoughts. He sleeps on the floor, Mama. Lena turned her head sharply. What do you mean? She asked, her tone harsher than she intended. Rosita's small hand reached for hers, fingers curling tight. By the door, Mama. Every night, I see him. He doesn't come in. He just lays his blanket there. Lena frowned, her breath catching. She remembered the folded cloth and pillow she had seen half hidden near the threshold, had thought nothing of it at the time. Rosita kept speaking, her voice soft with the certainty only a child could carry. He makes soup too, and he brushes my hair in the morning, but he never touches. The words pressed deep. Lena closed her eyes, her throat tight. She wanted to deny it, to keep the armor around her heart. Men always wanted something. Yet when she thought back, she realized she had never woken to his shadow looming, never felt his hand where it should not be. He knocked before entering, even with her half-conscious. He turned his back when she adjusted her blouse. He left water and blankets without a word, never demanding thanks. The next day, she began to notice more. The way her boots were set by the stove, warm when she slipped them on. The way the fire was already lit before dawn, heat spilling into the room so she would not wake in cold. A stool had been placed near the basin so she could sit while washing, though she had never asked for it. Each sign was quiet, almost invisible, but deliberate. Not the acts of a man claiming ownership, but of someone choosing care without asking for anything in return. Still, her pride kept her chin high. She did not thank him. Her fear still made her hands shake when he came too close. But at supper, when their eyes met across the table, she did not look away so quickly. And when Rosita laughed, loud and bright, Lena caught the flicker of a smile on Bo's face, and though it unsettled her, it also loosened something in her chest. Distrust still lived in her, sharp and coiled, but for the first time it was not the only thing. Something softer had begun to stir, fragile as new grass pushing through hard earth. The morning sun stretched long shadows over the Texas plains, painting the grass in pale gold. Bo had risen early to mend the eastern fence, his hammer ringing steady against the posts. Lena watched from the porch, her arms folded tight across her chest, Rosita clinging to her skirts. The child had begged to feed the chickens, but Lena held her close, her gaze fixed on the man working, with sleeves rolled, every strike of the hammer sharp with purpose. She did not trust him fully, not yet, but she could not ignore the steadiness in his movements, the way he carried himself, as if no man alive could bend him. Dust rose on the far horizon. 3 riders came hard and fast, their silhouettes dark against the morning light. Lena's heart dropped into her stomach. She gripped Rosita's shoulders and pulled her back into the shadow of the doorway, her breath quick and shallow. Bo had seen them long before they reached the fence. He set down his hammer, wiped grease from his hands with a rag, and stepped into their path with the stillness of a man who had no fear left to waste. The riders slowed, the one in front, tall and thin, with a leather duster that trailed in the breeze, swung down first. He carried himself with the arrogance of someone used to owning whatever he named. "Name's Doyle," he drawled. "We're here on business." He pulled a folded paper from his coat, the ink smeared, the edges stained, and held it high. "We've come to collect merchandise. Girl named Lena, property of Mr. Mercado. Says right here she's ours." Lena's chest tightened. Rosita whimpered and clung tighter, hiding her face in her mother's skirt. Bo didn't glance back at them. His voice was flat as stone. "I bought her," Doyle smirked. No, cowboy. You bought time. She still belongs to us. Hand her over, and we'll be on our way. Bo stepped forward, his boots firm in the dirt, his shoulders squared. Get off my land. The second rider spat and sneered. Or what? For a moment, the air held still, heavy as thunder before the storm. Then Doyle's man reached for his rifle. Bo moved faster. His hand pulled a lever hidden in the fence post, and a shotgun dropped neatly into his grip. The blast tore through the air, the sound rolling across the plains like judgment. The second rider crumpled from his saddle, screaming as he hit the ground. Doyle cursed, ducking behind his horse, the third man fumbling for his weapon. A gunshot cracked. Bo staggered as the bullet ripped across his upper arm, red blooming against his shirt. Lena screamed, rushing forward before she could think, her hand flying to her mouth as she saw the blood spread. Rosita cried out from inside the cabin, pounding against the door with small fists. Bo dropped to one knee, his jaw tight, the shotgun cocked again. His voice was a growl, low and certain. Next one takes your head off. The riders did not test him. Doyle cursed again, dragging his wounded man up into the saddle, and the three fled in a storm of dust, their arrogance bleeding into the horizon. Bo stayed on one knee, blood dripping into the dirt, his breath ragged but steady. Lena ran to him, skirts trailing, dropping beside him in the dust. Her hands shook as she pressed them to his arm, trying to stem the flow. You're bleeding, she whispered. He grunted. Not too bad. You're a fool, she said, her tears cutting lines through the dirt on her cheeks. You could have been killed. His eyes met hers, dark and steady. I've been dead before, he said, when I lost my daughter. Today I'm alive. Her breath caught. For a moment she could not speak. Then she pressed the cloth tighter to his wound, her hands trembling less. He had fought not for himself, but for her and Rosita, and the weight of it settled heavy in her chest. She had been ready to believe all men took, all men claimed, but now she had seen one bleed to protect. It shook her, unsettled her, and moved her in ways she did not yet have words for. The kitchen smelled of iron and smoke, the faint tang of blood mixing with the sharp bite of whiskey. Bo sat shirtless at the wooden table, his broad shoulders hunched, his right arm resting atop a folded towel. The bandage he had wrapped in haste was soaked through, the wound swollen and red around the edges. His jaw was locked tight, his breath shallow but steady. Across from him, Lena stood with a strip of linen in one hand and a small knife in the other. Her fingers trembled slightly as she uncorked the bottle and poured whiskey over the cloth. The hiss of liquid meeting torn flesh made Bo grunt, though he did not flinch. You sure you want to do this? He asked, his eyes narrowing as he looked up at her. I have seen worse, she said quietly, though her voice carried a waver. She leaned closer, inspecting the wound with the careful eye of someone who had done this before. Her gaze softened for a moment, and when he caught it, she said, I had a brother, back in Sonora. He was always fighting, breaking bones, coming home bleeding. I used to patch him up. Her voice faltered, then grew firm again. I know what to do. Bo nodded once, accepting the words without pressing. He held her gaze for a moment longer, then bit down on a strip of linen she rolled for him. Her hands hovered, slick with sweat, before she lowered the blade to cut away the ragged flesh. Bo's body tensed, his muscles rigid as stone, but he did not jerk or pull back. A muffled groan rumbled from his throat, teeth grinding against the cloth, yet his eyes stayed locked on hers. Lena worked quickly, her palms steadying as she cleaned and cut, dabbing whiskey into the wound, pressing fresh gauze tight. Her breath came fast, but her movements were sure, and when it was over, she tied the last knot with hands that no longer shook. Bo spat the cloth into the basin and leaned back in the chair, sweat beading across his brow. His chest rose and fell in slow, deliberate breaths. You have done that before, he said softly. Lena wiped her hands on her apron, her eyes lowered. I told you, my brother, she murmured. But the truth was more than that. It was survival. It was learning to be stronger than the world wanted her to be. She did not add it aloud, but it lingered between them all the same. Silence filled the room, but it was not heavy this time. It was softer, like a blanket laid over sharp edges. Lena turned her gaze toward the mantel, where a faded photograph sat in a wooden frame. A girl with soft curls, holding a lamb and grinning wide. "She looks like Rosita," Lena said. Beau's eyes followed hers. "Her name was June," he said, his voice low. "Fever took her in 3 days. My wife was gone a month later. Couldn't bear a house without her voice." Lena swallowed hard, her chest tight. She looked at him then, not as a captor, not as a stranger, but as a man carved by loss as deep as her own. Slowly, she reached across the table, her hand resting open between them. Not reaching, just waiting. Beau hesitated only a moment, before laying his rough, calloused hand over hers. Their eyes held, and for the first time since their paths had crossed, there was no suspicion, no anger, only trust in the quiet that surrounded them. The days after the shooting bled into one another, slow and steady. The kind of days filled with small tasks that stitched themselves into something larger. Beau worked with one arm bandaged, his strength diminished but his rhythm unchanged, splitting wood with slower strokes, fixing the hinge on the barn door, carrying water from the well, while his shoulder throbbed beneath the linen wrap Lena had tied. She moved through the house with quiet determination, tending to Rosita, tending to him, cooking meals that filled the cabin with smells it had not known in years. There was still a careful distance between them, but the space was softer now, less like a wall, more like a fragile truce. Rosita had grown bolder. The child followed Beau out to the yard, carrying kindling in her little arms, chasing chickens that clucked indignantly, giggling when they scattered. She asked questions without end. Why the sky turned red at sunset. Why the mare's mane was soft. Why he always walked with a limp. Beau answered in his gruff way, short words, a shrug, a sideways glance. Yet each time, Rosita grinned as though he had given her the greatest secret in the world. Lena watched her daughter closely, worry etched into every line of her face. But when she saw Rosita's laughter, she let it linger, without interruption. One warm afternoon, Beau saddled the small mare and lifted Rosita onto her back. The girl's legs barely reached the stirrups he had shortened for her, her hands clutching the reins awkwardly. "Easy now," he said, walking beside the horse. "Keep your hands steady." Rosita wobbled, but sat straighter when his hand brushed the mare's side. "You're doing better than most grown folks," he added, his voice low but not without pride. Rosita beamed, her cheeks flushed from the sun, her curls wild around her face. She leaned forward, giggling, as the mare plodded slow circles in the yard. Then she stopped, her little arms stretched forward, and without warning she wrapped them tight around Beau's neck. He caught her instinctively, lifting her from the saddle and holding her against his chest. She nestled close, her small hands gripping his shirt, her voice muffled but clear. "Can I call you Papa now?" The world stilled. The breeze seemed to hush. The mare flicked her tail and turned her head as though waiting for his answer. Beau's throat closed, his chest aching in a place he thought had long turned to stone. He did not speak. He could not. Instead, he held her tighter, his chin brushing the crown of her head, his silence louder than any word he might have found. From the porch, Lena stood frozen with a basket of folded clothes in her arms. She had come to call them in for supper, but the sound of her daughter's plea rooted her in place. She saw the way Beau clutched Rosita, not as a burden, not as property, but as though she were glass and gold at once. Her eyes burned, her hands shook, and when she set the basket down, the clothes tumbled into the dust, forgotten. That evening the house felt changed. Rosita ate her supper perched beside Beau, chattering between bites, her joy spilling into every corner of the room. Lena watched the two of them, her daughter's laughter filling the hollow spaces that had once ached with silence. For the first time, she looked at Beau, not only as the man who had protected them, but as something more, something steady, something she might one day lean on without fear. The cabin no longer felt like a cage, no longer felt haunted by ghosts. It felt like a home. The forge behind the barn had sat cold for years, a relic of days when Beau had needed horseshoes and hinges, when work had filled his hours and loss had not hollowed him out. Now it burned again, flames licking at the iron, heat spilling into the dusk. Bo stood over it with his shirt sleeves rolled high, sweat streaking his brow, his good arm steady as he worked the small piece of brass between the tongs. It had once been the firing pin of a revolver, a weapon that had saved Lena's life when he faced the traffickers at the fence line. Now he bent it into a circle, hammering it against the anvil, clumsy but determined. The shape was crooked, uneven, but strong, forged not for beauty, but for truth. Rosita watched from a safe distance, her eyes wide with curiosity. "What are you making?" she asked, her voice full of wonder. Bo glanced at her, his expression unreadable, then went back to his work. "Something for your mama," he said. The child tilted her head, her lips curving into a knowing smile. Though she asked no more, she only sat on a stump, her small hands clasped, watching as sparks flew and the rough circle took form. When the ring cooled, Bo turned it over in his palm, the edges jagged in places, the surface marred, but his chest tightened all the same. He slipped it into his pocket and wiped the sweat from his brow, his gaze drifting toward the cabin where Lena sat sewing by lamplight. Her profile was outlined against the glow, her scarred wrist bare as her needle moved in quiet rhythm. Something stirred in him then, something that felt like a beginning. The next morning, under the wide Texas sky, he asked her to step outside. She looked wary at first, brushing dust from her skirt, her hand resting protectively on Rosita's shoulder. Bo said little, only reached into his pocket and held out the small brass ring in his calloused palm. "It isn't much," he said, voice low, "but it's honest. I lost everything once, but you and Rosita gave me a reason to live again." His words faltered, and he shook his head. "I can't give you gold or promise you comfort, but I can give you what's left of me." Lena stared at the ring, her breath catching. Her fingers trembled as she reached out, brushing against the rough metal. The scar on her wrist showed pale against her skin, the mark of chains that once bound her. She swallowed hard, her dark eyes shimmering as she looked at him. "Yes," she whispered, her voice steady, despite the tears that threatened. By afternoon, neighbors gathered, some out of curiosity, some out of respect. Miss Alberta, the seamstress, brought wildflowers tied with twine. Rosita skipped ahead of her mother, scattering petals from a small basket, her curls bouncing in the sun. Lena wore a simple white dress, hand-stitched, uneven at the hem, yet radiant in its plainness. She walked slowly across the field of bluebonnets, her chin high, her eyes bright. Bo waited at the makeshift altar, no more than 2 crates draped in linen, his hair combed for the first time in weeks, his shirt stiff at the collar. His hands fidgeted with the ring until she reached him, then stilled as he slid it onto her finger. The fit was imperfect, the metal rough against her skin, but it held. Their vows were few words, spoken softly under the Texas sun, but each one carried the weight of survival and choice. When Bo bent to kiss her, it was simple and sure, sealing what had already been true long before the ring. Rosita cheered, flinging the last of her petals into the breeze, her laughter carrying across the plains. The crowd smiled, some wiping their eyes, others tipping hats in quiet respect. Bo took Lena's hand, their fingers twining, and together with Rosita skipping between them, they walked back down the path of scattered wildflowers. For the first time in years, the air around Bo felt light, as though the land itself had accepted this new beginning. The days after the wedding unfolded slow and gentle, marked not by grand gestures but by the ordinary rhythm of life. Morning came with the smell of coffee and the sound of Rosita's bare feet pattering across the floor. Lena rose early to cook, though her hand was unpracticed with the iron skillet. Twice she burned the eggs until the edges curled black, filling the cabin with smoke, but Bo ate every bite without complaint. He only said, "Could use more salt," and Rosita giggled, covering her mouth with her small hand. By the third attempt, the eggs turned out golden, and Lena's smile when she set the plate down was proud and unguarded. Clothes were patched by the fire in the evenings. Lena bent over a basket of mending, her needle flashing quick and steady through worn fabric. She stitched Rosita's dresses until they hung neat again. though her own sleeves bore uneven hems that made her laugh softly at herself. Bo sat across the room, carving scraps of wood with his knife, his quiet presence filling the space without pressing on it. Sometimes, Rosita sprawled on the floor between them, her tongue caught in concentration, as she drew pictures on scraps of paper. She drew herself holding hands with her mama, sometimes with a lamb or a sun overhead, and then one day she added Bo. She drew him tall, with broad shoulders, his hat bigger than his head, his hand joined with theirs. She pinned the picture above the hearth with a sliver of tin. When Bo noticed, he paused in his carving, his lips twitching at the corners, though he said nothing. Laughter began to weave through the house, not constant, but steady enough to feel like a thread binding them together. Rosita told stories about the hens, about how one chased her through the yard, and Lena laughed so hard she dropped her needle. Bo chuckled once, a rare low sound, and the girl clapped her hands in delight at the noise. Supper became a place of warmth. Bowls of beans and cornbread passed back and forth, the clink of spoons and the soft hum of voices filling the air where silence had once reigned. One evening, when the chores were finished and the lamps burned low, Bo brought in a small plank of wood from the barn. He worked at it with his knife while Lena mended, and Rosita hummed to herself. For hours the only sound was the scrape of blade against grain, until finally he set it down on the table. The letters were rough but clear, carved deep and honest. La Casa de Esperanza. Lena reached out with her fingers, tracing the words slowly. Her breath caught, and when she looked up, her eyes were shining. The House of Hope, she whispered. Bo nodded once, his face unreadable, but his hands steady. They hung the plaque over the door the next morning. Sunlight caught the fresh grooves, gleaming as Rosita clapped and declared it beautiful. The name seemed to settle over the cabin like a blessing, softening the rough edges of the walls, filling the rooms with a sense that what they had built together was more than survival. It was a home, stitched from burnt eggs and patched dresses, warmed by drawings pinned to the hearth, and held steady by the quiet vow carved in wood. A year slipped by with the turning of seasons. The ranch, carrying the marks of work and weather, but also of life, returned. The fences had been mended, the barn freshly painted, and the garden stretched in neat rows that gave back more than Bo had ever expected. Corn grew tall, beans climbed their stakes, and hens strutted fat and spoiled under Rosita's care. The cabin itself seemed changed, not in its walls or roof, but in its spirit, as if laughter and footsteps had seeped into the wood, softening its edges. Scars remained, in the land, in their bodies, in their memories, but the sharpness of fear had dulled into something quieter, something that no longer dictated each breath. Rosita had grown taller in that year, her curls wilder, her voice brighter, her drawings multiplying across the hearth until the wall looked like a gallery. She could ride the small mare without wobbling now, her hands steady on the reins, her laughter carrying across the pasture as she circled wide, pretending she was leading a cattle drive. Lena often stood watching her, pride softening the lines that hardship had once carved deep. She still bore the marks of her past, the scars on her wrists, the faint bruise-like shadows that never quite faded from her collarbone. But her eyes no longer carried the wild fear of a cornered animal. When she smiled, it was real, unguarded, and it made the whole cabin brighter. Bo moved differently too. The limp in his step remained, a permanent reminder of storms survived, but his shoulders no longer bent with loneliness. He carried himself with steadiness, not weight, and when he looked at the house he had once thought of as a grave, he now saw something alive. The field beyond held bluebonnets again, scattered by Rosita's small hands, and he often caught himself standing still just to take in the sound of her voice mixing with the wind. At dawn, the porch became their gathering place. Bo sat in the rocking chair he had built, Lena beside him with her shawl draped loose, her head resting against his shoulder. They said little, watching the first light wash over the land, the horizon blushing pink and gold. Rosita darted through the yard, her dress catching dew as she chased after the hens, squealing when one flapped too close. Bo slipped his arm around Lena, his hand warm over hers. She leaned into him, their silence no longer filled with suspicion but with peace. steady as the rising sun. Some stories end with violence, with gunfire and grief, but theirs had chosen another path. It was not without scars, not without hardship, but it was marked more by the quiet redemption found in staying, in choosing each other, in building something where nothing had been. Bo had not expected grace. Lena had not expected peace. But they had both found it here, in the heart of Texas, with a child's laughter holding it all together. If this tale touched your heart, if you felt the grit and grace of love that grows out of hardship, then subscribe to Western Love Legends. Like, share, and leave a comment so we know you are out there riding with us through these stories. And remember, even the toughest rancher can be undone by a little girl calling him Papa, and by eggs burned 3 mornings in a row.